Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the Institute of Health and Social Care Management and the latest in our Power Hour series. This is with our Equality, Diversity and Inclusivity Special Interest Group. And we're absolutely delighted today to be joined by Emma Underwood, who's Training Officer for Opening Doors and an Opening Doors Ambassador. And Emma, we're thrilled that you could come here today. You're going to be talking about understanding the needs of older LGBTQ plus people and shared lived experiences. This is a subject that we've covered a little bit in the past with other speakers, but we're really looking forward to hearing from you. So if I may, I'm going to hand straight over to you and you can do your thing. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, John. I am indeed the training officer for Opening Doors, but I'm not the ambassador. In fact, Angela Trail is the wonderful ambassador who is joining me today. Would you mind pinning her to the spotlight as well? Thank you very much.
Absolutely. So there we go.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, John. It is so wonderful to be here again today. Some of you might have been to one of our past talks with the IHSCM. Where we've discussed some similar topics. We're going to be taking a bit of a different track today. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. So bear with me whilst I do that. Right, so hello and welcome everybody to Understanding the Needs of Older LGBTQ plus people. This is maybe not surprisingly, but a very under talked about topic in the health and social care sector. So it's really great to have this opportunity to shine a bit of a light on this subject. My name is Emma Underwood. I am the training officer for Opening Doors and I use she, her pronouns. It's a job title that does what it says on the tin. I create and deliver training primarily for healthcare, social care and housing sector organisations. I come from a background primarily of community organising and social activism with a specialism in legislative reform. And I try and take those elements of creating real, tangible change for people's lives and embedding it into the training that we deliver. And I'm joined by the ever wonderful Angela Trail. Angela, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, the ever wonderful Emma. Yes, so I am the ambassador. What that means is I'm a volunteer for Opening Doors and help Emma in the training and do other activities when I can. My background is not to do with social care or healthcare matters. So my background is completely unrelated in freight logistics and supply chain management. So I won't go into that because you'll all switch off and fall asleep. But yeah, that comes with some skills. And it's suggested that that's speaking and helping training. So here I am to help. I go by the pronouns as it says here on the slide, she, her. I'm a trans woman. Okay.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you very much. So today we're going to be covering a few different topics. We're going to start off with some introductions, a few ground rules, setting the scene, etc. We're then going to take a look today at history. One of the things that we get told fairly often when we come and deliver these sorts of sessions is that people don't understand the context behind what we're doing. Why older LGBTQ plus people are less likely to be confidently accessing health and social care services. So some of you may have come to our original talk, which discussed kind of the needs specifically. We're going to look now at some of the reasons that those needs might be embedded. And then Angela has kindly offered to share her story. She's going to talk a little bit about her lived experience, about her life as a trans person, and so you'll all get the absolute privilege of hearing that. And then we will sum up for you at the end. With this session, I am going to be fairly quiet. Angela is going to be leading for the most of this. You'll be pleased to know. We will hand over to her in just a moment. But before we do so, let's go over some of those introductions. A few ground rules to keep us grounded, if you will. Please do keep yourself muted unless you're speaking. It just helps us to reduce our background noise, helps keep us focused. Every question is welcome. this is a really, really important point, because one of the things that I hear so often is people telling me that they are afraid to speak out. They're worried about saying the wrong thing or sounding silly or even being offensive. And I think in this kind of learning environment, it's really important that we can acknowledge that we can make mistakes, that it's okay. We'll work with you with the language that you have in this moment. So if you do have a question, just put your hand up in the air or type it in the chat, whichever feels most comfortable. We'll come to it whenever we see it. We operate what we call a brave space policy. Some of you might have come across the phrase safe space before. It's a similar sort of concept. We want everybody in this space to feel confident and comfortable engaging with these topics. But we do also acknowledge that some of these topics can be quite challenging. So please do bear with us as we go through those. And then finally, we will always assume best intent. We assume that you have come here in good faith, that you've come here to learn. And we hope that you assume the same of us, that we've come here in good faith, that we've come here to have a dialogue and a discussion with you. So in today's session, we might be discussing homophobia, biphobia and transphobia, violence, both verbal and physical, historical mistreatment, mental health, mental illness and illness more broadly. So before we get kicked off with today's session, just a brief word on who we are, who are Opening Doors. We are actually the largest provider of direct services for older lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans people in the UK. And we say that we aim to ensure that all older LGBTQ+ people live happy, healthy and independent lives that are free from loneliness, isolation, prejudice and discrimination. And I like to think that we managed to do that on a pretty good day. We have our origins as a gay men's support group, and whilst we now offer our services to a much broader range of demographics, we try and keep a lot of that ethos of bringing communities together through the various social groups and activities that we run. We also engage in larger scale events, including Pride, which we were at for the first time since 2019 this year, which was very, very exciting. And we also have our befriending service, which is quite simple. We match up an older LGBTQ+ person with a younger volunteer. That volunteer then goes into that person's home or local neighbourhood in an effort to spend time one-on-one with them and decrease social isolation. We are often called upon to consult on policy on both a local and national level, and we're able to do this in no small part thanks to our wonderful research team, who make sure that we are really on the cutting edge of knowledge when it comes to older LGBTQ+ people. A lot of that knowledge then also informs the training that we deliver to organisations such as yourselves, as well as our Pride in Care quality standard. One of the things that I hear fairly often when I talk about what it is I do, or even when I pitch the training to various organisations, they say, well, why do I need to come and sit in on an hour and a half, 3 hours training on older LGBTQ+ people? I just treat everybody the same, everybody exactly with exact equality. And I think for the most part, for kind of your day-to-day life, that is a pretty good way of going about things, about treating people with complete equality. But when it comes to service delivery, we understand that that might not always be the best way forward. So this sort of cartoon here illustrates maybe why that might be the case. So we start off over in the top left here with inequality. Two people, both trying to access services, right? Access resources, opportunities, apples, whatever it might be. But neither of them can proactively engage with those resources, with those opportunities. They've got to wait for them to come to them, and they're unevenly distributed. So what happens then if we treat people exactly the same, right? With service delivery, treat them with exact, complete equality. Well, great, this person can now reach those resources, but this person here still can't, despite being treated exactly the same. So it's at that point then that we start treating people with equity, right? We give them custom tools that address and identify that inequality. And now they can both reach those resources. That's fantastic. But those resources are still unevenly skewed over to this side. So that's when we enact justice, right? We fix the system, we straighten the tree out, we redistribute those apples. And it's at that point that we can start treating people with true absolute equality. Hopefully that gives you a bit of an insight into why this is so important. To hammer home that point then, I'm going to share this brief video with you from one of our members. However, I think that I don't believe I have shared my sound, so bear with me one moment whilst I come out of screen share and I go back in. Oh no, I had shared my sound. It's always the way. Right, I will play this for you now.
I never ever saw a time that we would ever not be hated and despised, because it was actually overwhelming. I was 16 in 1969, and I was told I was a pervert, and I didn't know the word lesbian, I didn't know the word gay, and I didn't know the word queer. The only words I heard were pervert. As soon as I came out, I was confronted face to face with homophobic remarks from my colleagues. I was told things like, oh, you're disgusting, what you do isn't natural. Sold my house, moved in with a friend, rented with her in London. I met her at a school reunion, a straight woman, when we were great friends. And then in 2012, 5 years ago, I retired. So I entered the world of the old, you know, my demographic, which were old people, British, white, and I know this is a generalisation, but unfortunately it's true. They're quite homophobic, so I went back in the closet. I go on YouTube, and I was watching an old episode of the Underwood, and underneath they always put recommendations, and it's all young people have put their YouTube videos on, and they're talking about being positive and being gay, and they're so matter of fact about it, and I just think, why can't I be like that? I thought, right, I'm coming back out of the closet, you know, I'm not going to stay. I don't want to go into my old age in the closet. I spent my youth in the closet, and it's horrible. And why should I go into my old age back in that awful place?
Hopefully that gives you a bit of an insight into why this work is so important. So, as promised, we are now going to have a look at history. We're going to take a step back through time and have a look at the history of LGBTQ plus people through the latter part of the 20th century. And we'll have a look then at how that might relate to health and social care, the kind of impact that it might have. We're going to start here with this word, with the word gay, because it is a word that has many, many meanings, but it's important to trace its origins. You might already know that this word originally, and still does to this day in some contexts, means happy and jovial and excited, and I still really like that definition. I think it's a great boon to our community. But it wasn't until the 1940s that this word started becoming a word that was used as a code word amongst LGBTQ plus people to communicate to others of their LGBTQ plus status. They needed a way to tell others, to share their experience, and to find others who were like them. And so using this covert word was a way to be able to do that. Of course, as with any kind of code word or kind of community-based lingo, the more popular it became, the easier it was to spot. And so by the time the 1960s rolled around, it had been dropped as a code word and had been used to describe the LGBTQ plus community as a whole. So it didn't matter whether you were a lesbian, whether you were a bisexual person, whether you were a trans person, gay was the word that was used to describe that community as a whole. Moving on from that descriptor as a community then, it also became a political unifier. It became a word that was used to unite people behind a cause, gay rights. Gay is good, the slogan from the 1960s, early 1970s, was used to unify that group with one another. And by that point then, of course, there were other words that were being used to describe people more specifically that were becoming much more popular in use. Words like lesbian, words like bisexual, words like transsexual, all being used to describe individuals. So that's where we went from gay as a code word to gay as a community descriptor to a political unifier. And then eventually we found ourselves with the acronym of lesbian and gay, and then into LGBT in the 90s. And now finally we're arriving at LGBTQ plus, although there are plenty of other variations on that acronym that I use to this day. I am now going to hand over to Angela, who is going to take on this history section for us.
Thank you, Emma. So, yes, it's worth remembering that in England it was illegal to commit a homosexual act until around 1967. I think it was about 10 or maybe 15 years later that it was made illegal in Scotland. So they were lagging behind, unfortunately. So being associated with any homosexual act gave you a sense of criminality in the eyes of the law, which is quite preposterous. Gay and bi men and trans women went to prison on average between 7 and 18 months for homosexual acts. The highest sentence or the longest sentence recorded was 2 years. And trans women were prosecuted under the Vagrancy Act. So expressing yourself as trans, effectively the law saw you as soliciting for sex. So that's how they would prosecute trans women particularly. In prison, gay men, trans women would be really at the bottom of the pecking order. They would be subjected to horrendous bullying, harassment, often violence, not just by the other prisoners, but also by prison guards. Such was the status that they held such people in. I mean, I would love to say this is all history for trans women. They're still treated very much in a similar way. In fact, a lot of trans women are treated as paedophiles in prison. They're separated from others and put in with paedophiles in prison. So this stigma still goes with people, gay and particularly trans women today. So what would often happen is that press would get hold of a story and name and shame LGBT people, especially men and trans women. They'd try and out people to their families, to their friends, to their work colleagues and employers. It was seen as something that would help sell papers. It was sensationalism, particularly, of course, if the people they were outing were somehow celebrities or of a particular status in public life. Front page news in national press would grab these, but local press also did the same thing. So nowhere was really safe if you were LGBT. And this naming and shaming effectively resulted in an ostracization from families, from your friends, from your work colleagues. And many people actually felt they had to, for their own safety, but also for the feeling of shame and guilt, leave their local communities, leave their homes and head to usually the larger cities where there was some form of anonymity afforded to them, and also where some of the others would, in a similar situation, they would start to form their own small communities and networks, and where people could feel safer and among people that they could feel safer with, but they'd lost their homes. A notable case was in 1961 where of this outing, a successful Vogue model, April Ashley, was outed by the Sunday People newspaper and subjected to hate campaigns by the wider media. And that basically meant that she'd lost her work. She could no longer work again as a model in Britain. And before that, nobody had ever realized that she was trans. So these things can have a real devastating impact on people's lives. The picture of a lesbian bar here in London is used here to show that whilst lesbians and bi women didn't actually go to prison for homosexual acts because the law didn't recognize that act, didn't recognize lesbians. But nevertheless, they could still suffer some terrible discrimination and prejudices by the legal system. When a woman was in a relationship with men and then had children, and then later identified as lesbian, they would invariably lose access to their children in child custody cases because the law saw them as unfit mothers. They saw them as innately violent and therefore a danger to the children, which is, again, of course, absolutely ludicrous, but it's really worth raising that just to show the environment in which people lived and what they had to go through if they were ever sort of found to be lesbian. The armed forces, again, is another area in society. Emma, if you could move the slides on, please. It's an area where lesbian, gay, trans people have been subjected to horrendous discrimination. This is a picture of a lady called Vito. She was a British naval officer and she was a lesbian and she was outed, and as a result she was dishonorably discharged from the Navy, and she lost all her pension rights as well as her job because it was illegal to serve in the armed forces if you were LGBT. This was Vito's dream career. She lost this, her career was therefore ruined. And this went on until the year 2000 when that criminality, if you like, was lifted. But still today, people who were dishonorably discharged, disgracefully discharged, some would say, they're still fighting for their rights, their pension rights that they lost when they were fired from the armed forces. And that was up until 2000 when that law changed. But again, 22 years later, still fighting for their pension rights. Now with trans people, the medical profession really took over responsibility for one's transitioning. They were the gatekeepers, they still are the gatekeepers. And one might say they are trying to prevent you from transitioning by putting barriers in place, by being these strict gatekeepers. In 1979, there was a documentary. For me personally, I think it was the first time I'd been exposed to someone else who was certainly feeling the way that I was. The documentary was called A Change of Sex, and this is a picture of the person, the subject of that documentary, Julie, and it showed her going through that gatekeeping process and fighting all the way against the most cold and horrendous and obnoxious doctors and psychologists who really attempted to belittle her and run her life. But she fought and she was finally successful and got through, even though she was treated like a child most of the time. But of course, those who transitioned previously would often lose their homes, they'd lose their jobs. And despite the fact that having a job and a home were important criteria to proving to medical staff that you could successfully live in another gender. It was a vicious circle, so that they'd lose the things that would actually be needed by the medical profession to prove that you were who you say you were. And that is still kind of a case today. It's not quite as bad, but there's still some strict gatekeeping going on for trans people. And again, the medical profession doesn't have a particularly colourful past. This machine here is linked to a version or conversion therapy that was established by the Maudsley Hospital in the UK, Maudsley Hospital in South London, where generally, gay men were given electric shocks when shown pictures of semi-naked men and other kinds of images that would normally cause arousal, in the thought that by subjecting them to horrendous electric shocks, that would convert them, that would change their behavior. It would cure them from being gay. They'd also use pills, medication that would create nausea or violent stomach cramps and vomiting as another means of trying to create that behavioral change, and all their responses and reactions would be recorded on machines like this, as you see here. At its height, men and women were treated for homosexual behaviour change in specialist clinics up and down the country, in London, in Birmingham, in Manchester, Glasgow and Belfast. And the practice only stopped in 1980, when the Maudsley and other medical centres realised and acknowledged finally that it didn't work. But these leave a lasting legacy of distrust about the medical profession by many LGBTQ+ people who experienced these treatments or had friends who went through such treatment. Now, many of us are familiar with the history of AIDS in this country. The first person died in 1981 of the then very mysterious pandemic that was going on, epidemic that was going on, and largely affecting the gay community. Many people lost loved ones during this time, and often in agonizing ways. And in the early days, people didn't know how to treat them. They were scared of them. And there was also the media largely pushing the idea that this was a gay plague. Religious leaders, politicians, the police also described it as a gay plague. And they claimed, as we now know wrongly, that it was only gay people that got this and passed it on. We now know that they passed it on to the wider community. It wasn't a gay plague at all. A disease that can affect absolutely anybody. Of course, now we've got medications which can keep people alive almost indefinitely, it seems now, which is absolutely amazing. But back in the day, many of our members lived through that period where they saw their loved ones dying horribly. And many of our members have AIDS, but are fortunate enough to have survived and are on the medications. So these things, again, kind of reflect a little bit on how people live and how they have and view health services, social services, because they remember such traumatic times when there wasn't always the understanding of the issues that there is today.
Thank you, Angela. So what we're going to do now is we're going to have a think and a bit of a discussion with those of you who are here in the room. I would like us to have a think about how might that history impact on someone's engagement with health and social care. Think back to all of the stuff that we've spoken about the health and social care practices, about links with authority, about the way that people were treated. And I'll come out of my screen share so that I can see some of your faces. Would anybody like to offer anything that they'd like to reflect on about how they think that kind of history might impact on somebody?
Can I just add a thought? It's kind of a bit unfair, really, on me going because it's the area that I research. Yeah, I was lucky enough to already speak at one of these, looking at LGBTQ plus microaggressions, because that's the area that I research, particularly for people with dementia and older people looking at it. So, but yeah, I know I spoke a lot about Foucault and internalising governmentality and how we internalise a lot of this, and this is what I normally talk about, is that previous trauma and the impact of previous trauma and how that impacts. But I'm going to have my rant that I don't often get to have within care settings, and that's my absolute distaste of memory lanes, because for me that forces people to go through a traumatic lived experience, and it's not just for us LGBTQ plus folk. It can be for anybody, people who have fought in the war, who have PTSD, etc. You go through this memory lane that's being forced on you, because it's normally the main memory lane that goes up to the dining room, and then you bring back all these previous memories, and you are literally forcing somebody to go through this like more a torture chamber, and that's the frustration and the impact that that has on people. And the amount of care homes that I go in and I consult with and I help develop their practice to become inclusive, and they've got this beautiful memory lane, and it's just I just want to rip it down. Because it's not about not saying do reminiscence, but it's about maybe having it in a corner where you're not forcing somebody to go through it, and being culturally sensitive with that reminiscence. And it's for all different cultures, all different backgrounds, all different type of people. So that's really my big rant that I'm just going to use this time, because as I said, it'd be a bit unfair on me to really unpick everything when that's something that I write quite extensively on, and I think it wouldn't give people a chance to talk about their thoughts on it. But that's my biggest rant, is hatred of memory lane. So I'm just going to use that just to have that little rant there.
No, thank you for that, and please do give your insight. I think it would be excellent to hear from you and your experience, especially as a researcher in this area. But you are so right. Those lived experiences of trauma, whether they are recent or historical, can have a huge amount of impact on somebody. And the assumption that everybody's life has been one that has been particularly happy or enjoyable or joyful can be damaging when we acknowledge the history around marginalized groups having been faced with such vitriol and oppression in the past. So absolutely, thank you very much, Phil. Anybody else would like to come in on anything? What kind of impact might that, if we think about aversion therapy, if we think about how the HIV and AIDS crisis was managed, how might that impact on somebody and their perception of care services?
Just talking, sorry, my camera's off because my internet's a bit dippy today. It's Adam Fennell, Director of Social Care at the IHSCM. I think the impact of AIDS is something that is still being felt today, and I think it's the public perception and the public approach to the virus that scared a lot of people and has put a lot of distrust within the health service, within the LGBT communities, especially those who went through it themselves. And I think quite at this moment in time, we have a risk of those traumas being triggered again with the current media campaign around monkeypox and it being prevalent in gay men. You know, be careful, you're gay, you're going to get monkeypox. And I think this sort of approach to, or the historic approach to treating health conditions within the LGBT community does fuel a distrust. And as we get older, let's say we end up with a cognitive impairment and we end up with trauma-informed care, it's only going to put a worry into receiving health services later on down the line. And we will be seen as having challenging behaviours or being aggressive. And I think there's a lot to understand around what might be perceived as a normal approach to health services to the wider public can be quite damaging to the long-term trust and opinion of people within the communities. I just thought it was interesting when you mentioned that then, because I've got this huge thing about monkeypox at the moment and how it's being advertised in the news, I will say, towards our community. But yeah, there's a real risk of, and it runs with people then not wanting to go to the doctors, not wanting to check out their health, you know, for fear of the stigmatization of what our community has been through and is still going through.
Absolutely. I remember when I first kind of was hearing about monkeypox through work, and then later on kind of in the press, and thinking, there's alarm bells ringing there as to how this is being communicated to people. But you're right, there's two elements there, isn't there? There's that public perception of LGBTQ plus people's health, and that kind of, we trace that back a long way, you know, well before the HIV and AIDS crisis. But we, you know, look particularly at that time, we look at James Anderson, the chief of Manchester Police, saying that gay people were dying in a cesspit of their own making. So of course there is that that public perception that, you know, of the way that LGBTQ plus people's health and healthcare it needs to be. And then you have that, again, that fear of from within the community of going and seeking medical help and medical aid when they need it, because they're worried about being outed, they're worried about any kind of discrimination that they might face from health and social care staff. 33%, 1 in 3 older LGBTQ plus people have faced discrimination at the hands of their formal carers. So the prevalence of this discrimination is really worryingly high. So you're absolutely right there. Any other thoughts from anybody else?
Could I just spin this around the other way, Emma? I wonder, and we get a lot of reports from people who are delivering health and social care, who get abuse and unpleasantness from people whom they are serving.
Yeah.
And that's something that we shouldn't overlook as well, and how difficult and challenging that can be. And it's easy to dismiss it as, oh, they're ill, or they're old, or they just don't understand. Put it behind you, it's fine. But it hurts, and it's unpleasant, and it's unwarranted. But it is a fact of everyday life for people who are LGBTQ plus and who are trying to deliver health and social care, and they get faced with that kind of unpleasantness as well. So I just wouldn't want us to pretend it was just the other way around. Thank you. Yeah,
you're absolutely right. Unfortunately, the prevalence of homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia in the UK is very high, worryingly high. And we know that hate crime levels in the UK are increasing at the moment, especially against trans and non-binary people. That's been fueled by a lot of the stuff that's been going on in the press, a lot of the stuff that's been announced by the government lately. So trans and non-binary people especially do face that level of discrimination and hatred, unfortunately, by patients as much as anybody else, which is something that is very, very troubling and difficult to support with. Yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts before we move on with this? Yeah,
I
Adam.
have one also.
Yeah, Adam, you go on. Yeah.
No, it was just to touch on what John said and what you said, Emma, and I think it comes down to a lot of the time things being very black and white in people's views. I remember when the leadership race started with the Tories, and there was this whole, well, we only want 2 gendered bathrooms because that's how it should be. And actually, we've lost the ability to have civility within society to go, well, why don't we have 3 and just have 3 bathrooms in locations instead of it being either or black and white. But there seems to be a totalitarian approach from both camps at times on this is what it must be, and that draws a divide as well, which is a real shame. And it'd be great to get some civility back to acceptance of everyone and who we are. And you're right that the turf war is so damaging to trans rights at the moment that everyone sees things so one-sided, so negatively. There was a report this morning around a drag artist who is reading to children, going around councils and reading to children, and the whole thing was invaded by protesters and they had to be escorted away by police. And they're talking about sexualizing care, sexualizing children, and there's not this ability to actually look at celebrating individuality anymore, which is a real shame, and it again forces people back into that closet, doesn't it?
Unfortunately, the trans issue, in the heaviest quotation marks I could muster, is a wedge issue. It is being used to score political points. The trans community is a political football at the moment. We have seen every candidate from the Conservative Party leadership from the beginning, from its inception, decry trans people and say that they will crack down on ensuring that trans people shouldn't be afforded the same rights as people who aren't trans. I want to come in on your point there about civility on both sides, because I think it's something that comes up quite a lot, this idea that there's bad people on both sides, and of course the plurality of humanity means that there are nasty people everywhere. But one point that I really do want to stress is that for trans people, for kind of who are very much fighting for their rights, fighting to ensure that their rights don't get rolled back, of course that subject is going to be incredibly emotive. Of course they are going to be trying to claw every opportunity they get, because this is a community where there is a very, very real risk that we are going to be rolling back the rights for that community. And I know that sounds hyperbolic. I know it sounds worrying. I'm a trans woman. I've worked in the field of legislative reform for several years. I've been out for close on a decade now. It has never been worse than it is now. It is getting increasingly worse, increasingly more hostile to live as a trans person in the UK. And that is incredibly, incredibly frightening. Phil, do you want to come in there?
Thank you. Yeah. Just to reiterate, I'm a non-binary person. My research is in non-binary aging, which there is just nothing. I believe in the UK, I'm the only person researching this area. So, and that's another thing. At some point, I will send you an email, Emma, because I'd love to work with you. Because, as I said, I know the only other person I know that really looked at my area really is in the or Sweden, I believe. But I think it's really important to understand the hostile environment for trans and non-binary people. At the moment, for example, when we think about the conversion therapy, and it was making me laugh when Angela was talking about all this stuff and saying, thankfully we've got rid of this, and I'm there, the computer saying, no, we haven't. But it's not quite as physical, but the psychological torture of conversion therapy is still legal in this country, and it's awful. And the fact that they're putting this message out to say that this can still happen to trans people, but we will look at making it illegal for everybody else, it just really demonstrates the hostile nature of the political climate at the moment. And I think when we think about older people, and we think if we start looking at this in this very intersectional way about how hostile it is for transgender, diverse, non-binary people, and then these negative experiences, and then there's this absolute level of erasure for particularly non-binary people. As I said, I'm doing my literature review for my PhD at the moment, and I haven't found one article that really explores it in enough depth. And I've literally been looking for about a year now. Things will touch on stuff, but then it goes straight back to what it's like to be a binary trans person, which obviously still needs more research. But then it's just like all of this area, it's just so much erasure. So when you have that erasure with anybody who's gender diverse, transgender, and just LGBT generally, those needs just aren't being understood, aren't being seen. And that alongside hostile nature just creates this really damaging area where people aren't understood, people don't feel comfortable, people internalize that they maybe are wrong, that maybe they shouldn't be embraced. And then you've got the other aspect of being the pathologization, particularly of aging. We think about old people becoming senile, and that actually if somebody is gender non-conforming, expresses their gender in a different way, and even sexuality, we assert that as being maybe the dementia, the cognitive impairment, the person becoming older. impact that means is that we are managing somebody, we're not celebrating, which is my biggest. Every talk I do, everything, I always say it's better to celebrate the person, not manage somebody. And I think all of these things, so that me putting my professional input now into like a little bit around that, my area, I think these are my frustrations, and this is, and some of the previous stuff and the trauma that people have gone through previously, current trauma that people are going through, and then this erasure, all this compounds into this really negative experience, particularly for gender diverse individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing, Phil. Please do drop me an email if you're not in touch with Dr. Ben Vincent already. I will see if I can get you two linked up, because they are an excellent person to talk to about this. I've also seen Shannon in the chat there saying that we can't afford to skip over the compounding effects of intersecting identities in this conversation too. Absolutely. The effects of transmisogyny, the effects of racism alongside homophobia, biphobia and transphobia, all of that compounds. We are short on time, so I'm going to hand over to Angela, who's got about just under 10 minutes, I think, to talk through her lived experience. And I'm going to mute myself and turn my camera off so the focus can be on her.
Okay, well, thank you, Emma. Yeah, so everybody's story is unique, everybody's story is different, but let me tell you a little bit in the 10 minutes about my life experience. Given what you've seen and what you already know in terms of the history of LGBTQ plus people, the persecution, the humiliation, what you heard of the lady, Margaret, who was saying the only word she ever heard was pervert. I'm of a similar era. I grew up in the 60s and 70s, mostly, and the early 80s, in my late teens. All of that shaped my perception of myself. I had, because of what I was being fed by media, by people around me, what people said, the negative tones of people like myself, the feelings I was having, I had nothing short of disgust for myself, shame for myself, horrendous guilt, and ultimately loathed and detested who I was. And that never went away. That was always there. That was always in my background and actually shaped everything that I did from pretty much the age of 13 onwards. I was fearful of who I was. I was fearful of being left alone with myself, for fear that what I used to call the other person in me would come to the surface. And I was absolutely terrified of losing everything that I loved, everyone that I loved, if they should ever find out what was going on in here. Sometimes, of course, I say of course, because it was so natural for me, I would imagine ending everything. And the only thing that held me back from that was other people, in the love that I had for them, and a inbuilt sense of responsibility towards them. I didn't want to hurt them. I didn't want them to go through with any pain at losing the person they thought they knew. So that in itself kind of kept me alive. Even though, of course, I hated myself, I didn't give a damn about myself. No respect for myself at all. to me, I was a liar, I was a fraud, I was a freak of nature. I didn't deserve it. Sometimes I think, well, why can't I just let go of life? Why would anyone be upset if I wasn't here? They'd surely get over it pretty quickly, and if they ever realised who I was, they'd certainly get over it very quickly. So that governed everything I did. Eventually, fairly recently, I'd say, about 2.5 years ago, life got on top of me too much, and I surprised everyone when I came out. And some of my worst nightmares did come true. Yes, I lost my home, I lost my marriage, my wife, I lost my job, not directly for being trans, but because of the depression and the anxiety and the displays, my personal displays of those feelings were clearly putting myself forward as a great candidate for immediate redundancy. They'll take away the job and pretend it doesn't exist and call it something else. You know, it was that kind of thing. So it was an enormously traumatic experience to come out, but I didn't feel I had any choice. It was that or die, and if I come out, well, I'll probably die anyway. So what have I got to lose? Nothing. People have since said, you know, didn't you feel the feeling of freedom and joy and elation? No, I didn't. I hadn't planned to come out. I'd always planned to keep it hidden. I went into a period of utter despair because I was finally, I had to recreate myself. If I was going to make it, if I was going to live, I had to rebuild a life. I had to identify who I was. Yes, I knew that I was transgender. I knew that I felt and had always felt that I should have been female. But what sort of a person would I be if allowed to live totally freely and put to bed all those phobias and fears that I had about myself, or that disgust that I'd had about myself? So it's taken an awful long time. It feels like eternity to find a place where I'm now comfortable. I still see myself in the mirror and go, ugh, you know, there's 50 years plus of testosterone body shaping that I hate, but hormones help to some extent. I certainly went through a lot of period of time over the last 2 years thinking about suicide, far more actually, ironically, than before. But again, loyalty towards friends who really, really surprised me. They amazed me at just how many friends and some of my family stuck with me and supported me. And many were even proud of me. You know, what? This is crazy. They're proud of me? Why? You know, look at me, I'm a wreck. So there was light at the end of the tunnel. I have, through their help and through professional help, found a way through. And I finally got to a point about 10 months ago now, where I realized that I was no longer afraid of who I was. I was not afraid of being left alone with myself. All that fear part had gone. And that was quite a euphoric moment. I feel I'm making much more progress. I've realized that the rationale that was behind the disgust I had for myself, the hatred I had for myself, was wrong. It was based on a child's perception, a young child's perception of a world that child was living in at the time. And we have changed a lot. And of course, as we've already discussed, not perfect, and some really horrible signs of retrograde steps being made, and people with some agenda to push trans people to the edges of society, to hide us again, building up fear that somehow we're dangerous. That's worrying, and that's why I'm doing this, because we can't go back. Please, God, we can't go back to those days. So that's why I'm sharing my story to you. That's why I still have apprehensions about the medical profession and how they might treat me, and the legal profession and the media, particularly the media at the moment. So we can together make a stand again and just make sure these voices of a few but potentially influential people don't take a hold again and move us back to those images that we've just been seeing in this presentation.
Thank you, Angela. It's really powerful words of warning, and hopefully this training has given you a little bit of an insight into the history of the LGBTQ+ community, into some of our lived experiences as a community. That is all we have time for today. Thank you all so much for coming along. I really hope it was useful, and I wish you all the best in engaging with older LGBTQ+ people as service users and patients. Thank you very much.
Well, that was absolutely sensational. Thank you, Emma and Angela. We're most grateful to you both. I thought that was incredibly courageous, heartbreaking at times, hearing Angela's stories, and I feel very moved, I must say. I think you're an incredible woman, Angela. It's just fantastic what you've managed to achieve. Congratulations. That's all for today, ladies and gentlemen. That's it for the EDI group. I don't think we have an August meeting. Forgive me, I don't have my usually trusty assistant Jade Maloney along to remind me. I don't think we have an August meeting, so the next meeting of the EDI group will be in September. And if the presentation then is anything like what we've heard today, well, the queue should start in Dundee for tickets, to be quite honest. There we are. All right. Thank you very much, everybody.
Bye-bye.
That was marvellous. Mind how you go. Enjoy your summer. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Great job, Angela.
Thank you, John. Thank you very
Absolutely
much.
outstanding. Absolutely outstanding. We'd love you to come back. And we've got our national conference in London in April next year at the Excel Centre. It's part of a big show, and we're intending for that event, which will be very well attended indeed, because it's a physical event. We're intending that to be a series of workshops explaining stuff to people, make it very practical, kind of how-to, tools, techniques, ideas, thoughts. And we'd love to get you involved in that if we could. I think it would be a really powerful session if we could arrange that. So we will be in touch. Okay.
Lovely. Thank you, John. It was a pleasure.
Lovely to meet you. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.